Hey everyone, excuse me. Welcome back to English 112 here at Delta College. This is week 2 in which we're going to start the first assignment, which is going to be the evaluation essay. And to that end, we're going to discuss argument, voice, and audience today. So let's go ahead and get started here. Now, I've posted several video links on e-learning that are supplemental videos that sort of reinforce or enhance the things that I'm going to be talking about today. For example, we need to start with defining what is an argument. And the best definition for an argument that I've come across actually comes from Monty Python in their classic skit, The Argument Clinic. So definitely take a look at that. But the main point of that I want to focus on is the way that they do define an argument, which is an argument is a connected series of statements to establish a definite proposition. Now, argument is one of those terms which is often confused or misused within contemporary culture because we tend to use argument in a way that suggests a negative connotation, that it's a fight of some kind. And that's really not what an argument is, even though that's what passes for arguments in contemporary culture. So if you turn on the news and you see like politicians or political pundits arguing with each other, they're really just yelling at each other and calling each other names. And that's not an argument, that's abuse, as Monty Python points out. An argument is an intellectual process. It's comprised of two basic parts, which is thesis and evidence. A thesis is a statement of opinion. It's whatever point that you're trying to make and that you're setting out to prove. And then the evidence is all of the material that you marshal to support your thesis, to help prove your thesis. So think of it in terms of like a courtroom trial where you have the two contrary positions. Someone says that the defendant is guilty, the other side says the defendant is innocent, and those are their theses, and they marshal the evidence to help prove or convince to the jury that their side is the correct one. That's the way that argument works. So you have a main point that you set out to make, that is your definite proposition, and then you use evidence as a connected series of statements to prove that definite proposition. The simplest form of an argument is a syllogism, and this is a type of argument that relies upon deductive reasoning, because an argument is rooted in logical reasoning. And we'll discuss later on in the term the different types of rhetorical appeals that you can use. But for the most part, because, like I said, an argument is an intellectual process, it's based on some sort of logical reasoning. And we'll discuss logic later on in the semester. But for right now, again, the simplest form of an argument is a syllogism, which relies upon deductive reasoning. That is, it goes from some general truth to a specific conclusion. And the syllogism works by having typically a series of two premises, a major premise and a minor premise that leads to a conclusion. So x plus y equals z. The classic syllogism is all humans are mortal. That would be the major premise. The minor premise would be Socrates was human. Therefore, if he was human, he must have been mortal. That is the conclusion. So it moves from that general truth of all humans are mortal and tests it by looking at a specific example, in this case, Socrates, and then reaches a specific conclusion. Now, in order for the argument to be valid, the conclusion has to logically follow from the premises. So x plus y must equal z. To think about this in a different way, think about math equations. 1 plus 2 equals 3. Now, if your premises are 1 and 2, and your conclusion is 3, therefore you can say that that is a valid argument because the conclusion follows logically from the premises. It makes sense, in other words. In order to be sound, the conclusion has to be both valid and the argument has to be true. That means that the premises have to be true. Are all humans mortal? As far as we know, yeah, there's no evidence to the contrary, so that we can accept that premise as being true. Was Socrates human? As far as we know, certainly. So based on the available evidence, we can see that that premise is true. Therefore, the conclusion should logically be true as well, that he was mortal. So that makes that argument both valid and sound. So valid means that the conclusion makes sense based on the available evidence, and sound means that it's both valid, it's logical, and it's true. If you end up with a conclusion that does not follow from the premises, if 1 plus 2 equals 5, for example, then that's invalid because it does not follow from the evidence. When we argue, there are 3 types of claims that we make, which are claims of value, truth, and policy. And we're going to be dealing with each of these 3 types this semester, beginning with claims of value. A claim of value says that something is good or bad. It makes some sort of value judgment as to whether something's positive or negative. As an example of that, look at the readings in the argument section on e-learning. Specifically looking at Catherine Carr's "What Made I Have a Dream Such a Perfect Speech." This makes a claim of value because it's implied there in the title that this speech is perfect or the speech is really good. And if you look at her thesis statement, she says, excuse me, but there are several other reasons why this speech, delivered over 50 years ago, remains an example of one of the best speeches in American history. So she is making a value judgment about the speech, saying that it is one of the best speeches in history. It's in American history specifically. So it is very good. And then the focus of her article, of her essay, of her argument is explaining why it's such a good speech. So she looks at the evidence to support that thesis, that claim of value. Whereas a claim of value says that something is good or bad, a claim of truth says that something is so, that a situation exists. And it's the truth of that situation is so obvious that to deny it is folly. And looking at a classic example of a claim of truth, take a look at the Declaration of Independence. Pretty much every statement in here is a claim of truth. Now, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily factually true or that it's universally true, but the information or the ideas are being presented as if they are a universal truth. And that, like I said, it would be folly to disagree with them. Now, like I said, it doesn't have to be factually true, because for every thesis there is an antithesis, an opposing viewpoint. So an argument has to be arguable, meaning it has to have multiple perspectives and disagreements. So the Declaration of Independence, like I said, pretty much every statement in here makes a claim of truth. You have to accept its assertions as true in order for the arguments to be convincing. And the main thesis statement comes at the end of the second paragraph. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having a direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. So the point that the framers of the Declaration of Independence, and it was Thomas Jefferson who actually wrote the document, the point that he's making is that the King of Great Britain at the time was a tyrant, which is something which is arguable. And then the Declaration goes on to show proof of his tyranny by giving specific examples. And then finally, a claim of policy. Whereas a claim of value says something is good or bad, a claim of truth says something is so, a claim of policy says that something needs to change. So it puts forth a call for action or change in policy, that some sort of policy should be put in place in order to bring about a change. So it assumes that a situation exists and that the situation is bad. So it's assuming claims of value and truth in order to make the thesis that that situation needs to change and to call for a specific course of action to be taken. The classic example of a claim of policy essay is Jonathan Swift's A Modest Proposal, or its complete title is A Modest Proposal for Preventing the Children of Poor People in Ireland from Being a Burden on Their Parents or Country and for Making Them Beneficial to the Public. Now, first you have to note that this is a work of satire. And satire is something which is really difficult to see. You have to train yourself to get the joke, because satire is meant to be funny. Ultimately, it's meant to be a joke, but it's presented in a way that sounds really serious, and the joke only becomes apparent if you actually think about what's being said and how absurd it is. So satire works by making a situation appear to be so absurd as to be unbelievable, and therefore it causes or brings attention to the issue being discussed. So for Jonathan Swift, what he is arguing about is the condition of poverty in Ireland of his time, and he's responding to other proposals, other serious proposals that were made at the time on what to do with poor people in Ireland. And he saw those proposals as being so barbaric that he decided to mock them by making his own proposal, which is, in order to solve the problem of poverty, people need to eat the children of the poor. As he says in his thesis, let me find it here. Oh, pardon me while I find this. This is kind of buried later in the introduction. And we'll talk more about introductions later on. There is a sort of false belief that introductions need to consist of one paragraph, and they really don't. And if you look at these sort of models of different types of arguments, you'll see that the introductions consist of multiple paragraphs, and that's definitely true of the Jonathan Swift piece. And it is exactly at 1 year old that I propose to provide for them in such a manner as, instead of being a charge upon their parents or the parish, or wanting food and raiment for the rest of their lives, they shall, on the contrary, contribute to the feeding and partly to the clothing of many thousands. There is likewise another great advantage in my scheme, that it will prevent those voluntary abortions and that horrid practice of women murdering their bastard children, alas, too frequent among us. So his argument is, again, it's satire. He doesn't seriously think that people should eat the children of the poor, but rather he is responding to those other proposals that he saw as barbaric. And his claim is essentially, well, why stop there? Let's just take it to the nth degree and just eat the poor, because that's essentially what you're arguing for anyway. And so by mocking those other proposals and being absurd, he's able to draw attention to the problem. So his policy, or his claim of policy, is that, okay, here's a situation which is bad, the situation of poverty. It's a bad thing, so therefore we need to change it, and here's how you would go about changing it. Now, again, he's not being serious, but he argues in a way that is, if you were to take it at face value, would be disturbingly logical. And that's an issue, to go off on a tangent for a moment here, people have to be careful about. We sort of innately or instinctively believe what we read, or at least we believe that the person who is writing it believes it. And that's not necessarily the case. That's one of the problems with this epidemic of fake news that we hear about now. If someone writes it, it must be so, or at least that's our sort of our way of responding to it. And that's not true, because anyone can write whatever they want to. And as writers, we don't have to believe what we write. It's just our jobs to write it. And so that is what makes satire such a tricky thing to see, is because we tend to read things and to take what we read at face value. And we have to be careful about that, which is why we use those critical reading strategies that I talked about last time. Now, once again, writing is about power. We write in order to get what we want, or more accurately, to persuade others to give us what we want. And there are three main components to being able to write with power, or to employ power in writing. And that is audience awareness, voice, and knowledge and use of rhetorical strategies and appeals. For this first assignment, we're going to focus on audience awareness and voice. And moving on for the next few assignments, that's when we'll bring in the rhetoric. But for right now, you really need to develop the skill of being able to analyze your audience and use a voice that's appropriate for that audience. Now, let's start by looking at a couple examples of poor audience awareness. This first one comes from a student email to an English professor. Let's just take a moment to read this. Okay, what is wrong here? What is the problem? Well, for one thing, it is written in a very informal manner. Now, that's not necessarily a problem in itself. It depends on who your audience is. So if you were texting a friend of yours, for example, writing it in this way, using all this slang and these misspelt words and grammatical structures, if you were texting a friend of yours, that would be perfectly appropriate. It would make sense for that particular audience. But the audience here is an English professor. And so if you put yourself into that person's perspective, you'll see that this is not good. Remember when we talked about Dave Kerpen's article about how to be taken more seriously? You cannot take, or rather, as an English professor, you would not be able to take this person seriously because of the way that this has been written. So even though the content of the message is appropriate, the person here is just asking for some clarity or some direction on the next essay. But the way it's being presented is very inappropriate because it's too informal, and also the lack of quote unquote proper grammar is something which would be really annoying to someone who is an English professor, who is someone who is very keenly aware of grammar. The second example is not quite as problematic. This comes from a lawyer communicating to a prospective client. But if you are a prospective client, would you want to hire this lawyer? Like I said, it's not quite as bad as the previous example, but you'll see that there are grammatical errors in there. And I'm not sure if this is so much a matter of poor audience awareness or just being a bad writer. Because if you're going to hire a lawyer who is going to represent you in court, you want someone who is going to have the appearance of being educated and being professional. And that is not being communicated here. You don't get the sense of education or professionalism from the way that this is written. Now, the lawyer could be very professional, very educated, probably is in order to be a lawyer, but that's not the impression that you get from this message. And for some reason, my screen is not, oh, here we go. There was a delay in my screen moving forward. Okay, so good audience awareness can be found in marketing and advertising. And that's because marketers and advertisers get paid a lot of money to analyze audience demographics and tailoring their messages to specific audiences. And to look at examples of that, let's pause this video here rather, and then go and take a look at some of these advertisements that I've linked to e-learning. The first one is a Swiffer duster advertisement. It's called Book. The second one is Cheerios, just checking. And the third one is an ad for Dodge Ram called Hemi. Take a look at those videos, at those ads, and take a moment to think about who the audience for those ads are. Okay, you should be able to tell immediately that they're directed towards very different audiences. So the first one, the Swiffer ad, you can tell is directed towards women, more specifically 30 to 40-year-old women. And you can tell that because the sort of protagonist of the ad, the character that you're supposed to identify with, is the woman there, who appears to be in that age range, who has children who are sort of pre-teen, which we would associate with that age range as well. It suggests a high school education at least. There's nothing specific in the ad that suggests that you have to have anything beyond a high school education to be able to understand the message of it. It is a middle class audience, and we can tell that because of two things. First of all, the house in the ad appears to be very nice. It appears to be a middle class suburban kind of house. And also, we're dealing with what appears to be a stay-at-home mom who is playing into the traditional gender role of being the homemaker. And that conveys a conservative perspective that, you know, the mom's job is to stay at home, raising the kids and cleaning the house. And so when you look at the way the ad has been constructed, you can tell that it's directed towards a very specific audience because of the values that that audience has, both in terms of their worldview, but also in terms of their economic class, their education level, and their age. This ad is speaking to that audience's needs and concerns. Now, Cheerios is a bit different. It's hard to tell what the gender or the sex of the audience is here. It's more gender neutral. We see that represented by the male and female perspectives in the ad, showing just a nice little family career. We can solidify all that character in the ad. And college education class. And this suggests a more liberal perspective. And the key there to identifying the liberal perspective is the fact that you're dealing with an interracial family, which doesn't seem like, or probably doesn't seem like a big issue. But at the time that the ad was, the ad came out, it was very controversial. And in fact, there was a lot of negative feedback that it received when the ad went online. But we can see that the point, the message of the ad is that Cheerios is good for your health, which is more of a college-educated concern. It doesn't talk about how good the cereal is, how good it tastes. That would be something that would be directed towards a more specific or more rather general audience. Whereas by looking at the health benefits of the cereal, that is a concern that more college-educated people would be likely to have. So again, middle class based on the situation, the scenario, the home that we see represented, and the fact that we're dealing with a small family unit suggests a middle class economic background, but again, having that more liberal perspective. And then by contrast, the Dodge ad is very different, directly directed towards males and younger males, the 18 to 25-year-old sort of demographic. And that's because the message of the ad, that if you have this really awesome truck, you'll get all of these hot babes, really speaks to a juvenile sensibility. There seems to be a high school education. Again, you don't really have to have a college degree to be able to understand the message of the ad. It's very, very clear and very blatant. Dealing with a working class blue collar background, which stereotypically we associate that background with trucks. We tend to associate pickup trucks with people who are from more rural or working class backgrounds, and a more conservative perspective, because again, we have that sort of stereotypical gender roles being represented in the ad, as well as the conservative value that if you work hard, you can achieve. So we're meant to identify with those guys working in the fast food restaurant here. And if they work hard and they save their money, they'll be able to afford this really nice, really expensive truck. And they will fulfill their dreams. Okay. So you can see how those ads are directed towards very different audiences. And that's what you have to learn how to do as a writer, or what we have to learn how to do as writers, is be able to navigate between different types of audiences. Because whoever it is that has the ability to give us what we want, we have to be able to address their needs and concerns. And so every writing situation is going to be different then, and we have to be able to navigate between those different situations. So the first essay assignment is to write an evaluation. So you're going to be making a claim of value. So write a review directed towards a specific audience. And I'm not going to go into the particulars of the assignment here, because there is an assignment sheet which is posted on e-learning that does do that and gives you a step-by-step breakdown of how to go about writing this essay. But the idea is you need to choose some sort of product to review. It could be a physical product, it could be a book, it could be a movie, it could be music, whatever it is. Whatever your field of interest is, just take something that pertains to that field and then write a review of it. But the trick is you're going to direct your review to a specific audience that's going to be different probably from your own background. And the reason for that is, again, as writers, we need to be able to navigate between different audiences and learn to speak to different people on their own terms or in their own terms. The first draft of this is going to be due at the end of week 3 at 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time. And then the final draft will be due at the end of week 5. So the first draft, again, due at the end of week 3. That's going to be next week. And then 2 weeks after that will be the final draft. So let's talk more specifically about evaluations and the ways that evaluations work. So the purpose of an evaluation is to be helpful, because you want to tell your audience whether they should spend their time and money in the resource or the subject that you're reviewing for them. Should they spend their time and money on seeing a movie, for example, or buying this specific product? And so I want you to pause this video again and take a look at another couple videos. These are both reviews of superhero movies. The first one is Deadpool 2, and the other one is Batman and Robin. So pause this, go and watch those videos, and then figure out what makes the one helpful and the other one unhelpful. Okay, so helpful evaluations meet these sort of criteria. They stay on topic. They don't wander off. They don't go off on tangents, or they don't lose their train of thought. The Deadpool review definitely does that. It stays directly on topic. The Batman and Robin one wanders a little bit. A helpful review considers the audience needs and concerns. And as you see with that Deadpool review, it's directed towards a very specific audience of parents. And so it considers that audience's needs and concerns. If you're a parent and you're going to take your kids to see a superhero movie, what are some things that you would want to consider, such as violence, profanity, or the message in the movie? In that case, Deadpool is a good movie, but it's only good for a specific audience. The Batman and Robin review, it's really unclear who the audience is there. And therefore, we don't know what the audience would care about, what their needs and concerns are, because the writer or the person who has made that video doesn't consider those things. A helpful review uses relevant criteria, and I'm going to discuss criteria more specifically in a moment. But it bases the value judgment according to specific aspects of the subject being reviewed, and it's aspects that are going to be relevant to the audience, the things that the audience is going to care about. So again, the Deadpool review considers its audience of parents and what they would be concerned about. In this case, profanity, violence, and the message of a movie. And so it addresses those criteria specifically. The Batman and Robin review has no relevant criteria, or at least it's really unclear what the value judgment is being based on. We're just told that that person does not like that movie, which is a valid thesis, but there's no evidence to support it. A helpful review provides specific examples. The Deadpool 2 review does that exactly. It shows clips from the film in order to support its statements. Batman and Robin does not. A helpful evaluation is balanced. It looks at both the good and the bad. Deadpool rather does do that. It says that it is a good movie, it is entertaining, but it's not appropriate for children. And then the Batman and Robin one does not do that. It's all negative. It doesn't consider positive aspects of the movie. And then a helpful evaluation in this case would not include spoilers. Now that doesn't necessarily apply to every type of review, but if you're reviewing something that has a story to it, then you want to think about spoilers. You don't want to spoil the plot. And I really don't think either of these example reviews do that. So that's good. That's in their favor. But be careful of a review that does spoil, because that's not going to be very helpful. Now, I want you to note that the Batman and Robin video isn't really bad. Or rather, what makes it unhelpful isn't the quality of the video. Certainly, the Deadpool 2 review is more professionally made, but it's not the quality of the review that makes a review helpful or unhelpful. It's the content of the review that makes it helpful or unhelpful. And so the Batman and Robin review I actually find to be very entertaining and enjoyable, but it's not helpful because the content of it is not helpful, even though it is enjoyable, to me anyway. So there are three types of criteria that we base reviews on, which are aesthetic, practical, and ethical. Aesthetic criteria are those which pertain to the artistic elements of the subject of the review. How tasteful or how beautiful it is. How does it appeal to, or how well does it appeal to our sense of beauty? And aesthetic criteria are much more commonly discussed in movie reviews or book reviews or something along those lines. Something which tends to be more visually oriented tends to focus more on aesthetic criteria, although it doesn't have to, because again, you have to consider who your audience is and what your audience cares about. Generally speaking, if you're going to review a movie and your audience tends to be younger, they're going to be more concerned with aesthetic criteria. An older audience will be more concerned with practical criteria or ethical criteria. So aesthetic criteria, again, are those which pertain to taste in beauty. And so if we look at the example of the Hunger Games review by, I believe it's Lisa Schwartzbaum, you'll see that she focuses primarily on the aesthetic criteria because that's what's relevant to her audience. She says, this Hunger Games is a muscular, honorable, unflinching translation of Colin's vision. In this case, she says that one of the things that makes it a good movie is that it is true to the book upon which it's based. So it's a faithful adaptation. And that, again, is aesthetic. How well does it translate this one form into another? Is it pleasing in that sense? It goes on to consider the quality of the acting. And Jennifer Lawrence is, in her gravity, her intensity, and her own unmannered beauty, about as impressive a Hollywood incarnation of Katniss as one could ever imagine. So acting ability would be an example of aesthetic criteria because, again, it's dealing with something which is kind of intangible, but it pertains to how pleasing something is to the senses. So if you're reviewing a movie, for example, acting quality would be an example of aesthetic criteria, whereas, let's say, the length of the movie, how long it takes to watch, is actually more of a practical concern. And then Schwartzbaum goes on and says, director Gary Ross does a tight job of establishing the future meets 1984 vibe in Panem. So she says the quality of the direction is good. And you'll notice that she discusses a minimum of 3 criteria, and really good reviews do that. They discuss a minimum of 3 criteria, or at least have 3 supporting points to base the evaluation upon. Now, again, aesthetic criteria pertains to the artistic elements of the subject, how it appeals to our sense of beauty. Practical criteria focus on how useful or how helpful the subject of the review is. So if we look at Alexander's Domino's, the Pizza That Never Sleeps review, it's a review of Domino's Pizza. And she does discuss quite a few different types of criteria, but I just want to focus on the practical criteria that she discusses, or that she focuses on, because she does consider aesthetic and ethical criteria as well. But just for the moment, let's focus on the practical criteria, or how useful Domino's is. What makes Domino's good or practical? She says, because it's the only place that still delivers at 2 a.m. for one part. So she is a New Yorker, as she points out in her article, and New York is known for having really good pizza places. And yet she says she prefers Domino's, which is known for being, or has a reputation for being cheap, generic pizza. She prefers it because it's more practical, or it's more convenient because you can get it at 2 a.m. in the morning, whereas other places you can't do that. Another thing that makes it convenient is there are always coupons available, so you can find the perfect hot online deal. And so for people who are more budget conscious, especially college students, that is going to be a more useful concern to them. Yes, they want to know how good pizza tastes, but often the price of the pizza is going to trump that. So yeah, you might be willing to eat pizza that's not necessarily as good as something else simply because it's more affordable. And then not only that, but the app allows you to submit the pizza you assemble in the game to your local franchise to be fulfilled as a proper order. So she talks about the way that Domino's is marketing its pizza. One way is having this game-like app where you can construct a pizza in the app, and then how convenient or how easy it is just to take that perfect pizza that you construct and actually have it made. You can submit it to your local pizza place to make it for you. That is really convenient. So again, she does discuss aesthetic and ethical criteria, but here are some examples of the practical issues that she discusses, or that she considers when reviewing Domino's Pizza. And finally, ethical criteria. Ethical criteria refers to how morally good or correct the subject is. Does it support your value system, or does it not do that? And so if we look at Nussbaum's article on To Stir with Love, she evaluates cooking shows and how they've evolved over time from the traditional Julia Child programs, which primarily focused on teaching people how to cook, to the modern cooking competition shows. And she says, Julia Child took an occult discipline, once reserved for men in tall hats, and made it accessible to all. And that's really more of an ethical issue, because she says that part of the appeal of Julia Child's show was that it demystified cooking as, an occult discipline, as she calls it, and makes it much more accessible to people, and much more accessible to women in particular, who had traditionally been removed from sort of gourmet cooking. Even though traditionally women are the cooks of the household, when it comes to chefs traditionally have been more male. And so if you were to go out to eat and eat uh, sort of exotic or gourmet food, it was traditionally prepared by men. And Julia Child set out to demystify that and make it more accessible to women specifically, to empower women in that sense. Nussbaum goes on to say it's loud and it's ugly, referring to the modern cooking show. But it's also refreshing to come across participants who are not telegenic Hollywood types, let alone celebrity chefs. Instead, they're fat and sweaty, male and female, line cooks and small-time chefs from a wide range of backgrounds. So whereas traditional television shows focus on pretty people, she says that one of the advantages of these modern cooking shows, these competition shows, is that they empower people from various backgrounds who aren't necessarily pretty or beautiful. They're real people, she says, and she finds value in that. She thinks that's ethically good. And then she says, like much of TV drama, they glamorize workaholism. And on the better shows, the gimmickry is half the appeal. If you can survive this obstacle course, no regular kitchen can defeat you. So that's one of the sort of negatives as well as positives of these modern shows is that on the negative side, they glamorize workaholism. They show that people should devote their lives to cooking in order to be successful or to be good at it, which is not necessarily a good thing because it's presenting an unrealistic perspective. But at the same time, it makes the show much more dramatic and much more entertaining. So she is primarily focusing on the ethical issues and the way that cooking shows have evolved. Okay, and so we come to our homework assignment for this week. Now, like I said, every week in here there's going to be something that is due because that is how I keep track of attendance. For next week, that's going to be the first draft of your evaluation essay. So that's due, which is how I'm going to take attendance for next week. But for this week, there's another homework assignment where you have to email me. And in this case, you need to email me a link to a television commercial or a print ad, along with a paragraph in which you explain to what audience it is directed. So looking at what we did with the Swiffer and the Cheerios and the Dodge ads, that's what you need to do on your own. So find an ad and then identify, break it down into the different demographics of the audience that it's directed towards. So send me the link to the ad along with a paragraph in which you explain, okay, here's who the audience is, and here's how you know that. And that's going to be due at the end of week 2, so the end of this week, at 11:59 p.m. Okay, and that's it for this week's lecture. The focus is going to be on, like I said, working on that first essay and getting started on that. So go ahead and use the assigned readings for the evaluation section. Use those as models when you write your own evaluations. I've also posted a student example on e-learning as well that you can use as a model when you write your own. So make sure that you use these readings to your advantage. There is a reason why I've chosen them and why I have assigned them. Okay, so try to have fun with this, and I will talk to you next time. Okay, take it easy and take care.